The stock market plummeted without warning. Jack Spencer sat at his desk, staring at the screen as the numbers flashed red, indicating a total collapse. His mind raced. Only hours ago, everything seemed secure, his empire thriving. Now, it was crashing down, piece by piece. The headline screamed, "Wall Street in crisis, billions lost in minutes." He reached for his phone, dialing his partner, Michael Roberts. The call went unanswered. Panic gripped his chest as the weight of the situation settled in. The investments he had worked tirelessly to secure were now worthless. He felt the sting of betrayal. As the clock ticked, he knew time was running out. He had to find a way to salvage what was left before everything slipped through his fingers. But who could he trust now? His own reflection in the darkened window seemed unfamiliar. The man he once was slipping away. Every decision would matter now. One wrong move could leave him with nothing. The debt continued to stack up, threatening to engulf Jack Spencer entirely. He stared at the piles of paperwork in front of him, his stomach tightening with each document he sifted through. Calls were pouring in, creditors demanding answers, their voices harsh and impatient. Jack had always prided himself on controlling the situation, but now, for the first time in his career, he felt powerless. He couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. He had to make decisions that would either save or destroy everything. Each call, each meeting, seemed like a ticking clock, and Jack knew he couldn't waste any more time. With the pressure mounting, Jack made a decision. He would have to face his investors and do whatever was necessary to prevent them from pulling their funds. But what price would he have to pay to keep them on board? His thoughts raced as his future hung in the balance. Jack felt a pang of betrayal as the phone call ended. Sarah Edwards, a whistleblower from within the company, had just exposed a massive financial scandal, and Jack now knew that things were about to spiral out of control. The news had already spread, and the damage was done. Jack's own company was implicated, and with the scandal came a flood of media attention. Sarah's motivations were still unclear, but Jack knew one thing. She had exposed the very heart of the corrupt system he had worked hard to build. Now, Jack had to figure out how to navigate the fallout. He couldn't afford another misstep. His future and the future of his company hung in the balance, and as the phone buzzed with another call, he braced himself for more bad news. Jack sat in his office, his mind spinning with the news of Sarah Edwards' whistleblowing. Suddenly, the door opened, and in walked Michael Roberts, his longtime business partner. Jack's eyes narrowed. Michael had always been a steady force, but today there was something different in his demeanor. The tension was palpable as Michael sat down across from Jack, avoiding eye contact. Jack's heart raced as he realized something wasn't right. As they spoke, it became clear. Michael was involved. The deal that Jack had trusted him with had been sabotaged from within. Michael had been working against him all along. The betrayal stung, but Jack couldn't afford to waste time on anger. He had to act fast to protect what was left of his company. Jack stood at the window, staring out at the darkened skyline. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil within him. His once thriving empire was now at the mercy of the very forces he had trusted. As he glanced over his shoulder, he saw Adrian Blackwell enter the room, his former mentor and financial guru, who had fallen from grace after his own risky investments went south. Jack had always admired Adrian's intellect and insight, but today, Adrian seemed more a shadow of his former self. Despite his own downfall, Adrian was willing to help Jack navigate this crisis. But the question was, did Adrian have the answers, or had the financial world changed so much that even he couldn't help? The call ended and Jack Spencer sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Michael Roberts had confirmed his worst fear. The sabotage was far worse than he realized. The damage to the company was significant, and Jack's trust had been shattered. But there was no time for grief. He had to act quickly. The creditors were circling, and the media was already picking up on the story. The pressure was overwhelming. Jack knew the only way out was to take control of the situation, to spin it in his favor. But how? His mind raced as he considered his option. The once strong foundation of his business was crumbling beneath him, and Jack felt the weight of every decision. If he made the wrong move now, it would be the end. But if he could turn the narrative around, he might just have a chance at saving everything he had built. There was no room for mistakes anymore. Jack walked into the meeting room, his heart pounding in his chest. The group of investors sat around the large table, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for answers. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He was calm, calculated, and precise in his words. But inside, he was a storm. The stakes were higher than ever. If he couldn't convince them to stay, it would all be over. Jack explained the situation, emphasizing the steps they were taking to stabilize the company. But as he spoke, he couldn't help but notice the skepticism in their eyes. They were concerned. His words seemed to hang in the air, not quite enough to reassure them, but not quite enough to push them away either. As the meeting continued, Jack realized that he was standing on the edge. He needed to close this deal, or everything would fall apart. The deal was done, but Jack Spencer knew it wasn't over yet. Michael Roberts had just handed him the final documents. The terms were harsh, but it was the only way to keep the company afloat. Jack scanned the pages, his mind already racing to the next move. The money was secured, but the cost of the deal was steep. He knew the investors would be expecting results soon, and the pressure would only increase. There was no more room for error. Jack signed the documents with a steady hand, even though his mind felt like it was unraveling. The deal was a temporary fix, a lifeline, but it wouldn't be enough in the long run. Jack knew he would need something more, something to put the company back on top. As he closed the folder, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't just the investors. It was something darker, something he couldn't yet define. The tension in the room was palpable as Jack Spencer met with Adrian Blackwell, his former mentor. Adrian's advice had been invaluable in the past, but today, Jack wasn't sure if it would be enough. Adrian looked older, his once sharp mind clouded by the weight of his own mistakes. Yet, despite his fall from grace, Adrian still possessed insights that Jack needed. They discussed the deal, the state of the market, and what it would take to rise from the ashes. Jack listened intently, though a part of him couldn't shake the doubt in his mind. Adrian's words were filled with wisdom, but they also carried a sense of resignation. Jack had always admired Adrian's confidence, but now he wondered if Adrian was simply trying to salvage what was left of his own pride. As the conversation came to a close, Jack was left with a heavy heart, unsure of what the next step should be. The whistleblower, Sarah Edwards, had been silent for days, but now Jack Spencer was beginning to realize just how much damage her actions had caused. She had exposed the underbelly of the financial system, and now it was Jack's turn to pick up the pieces. He knew the risks of having someone so close to the truth, but he never expected things to spiral so quickly. Sarah was a mystery, her motives unclear, but her resolve was not. Jack had to find her, make her see reason before the authorities took action. But as he sat at his desk, contemplating his next move, he felt a growing unease. The story was spreading like wildfire, and soon the media would be after him. If he couldn't find Sarah and control the narrative, everything would fall apart. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. An unexpected visitor, someone who might hold the key to saving everything. The days after the deal were a blur. Jack Spencer's mind raced with endless calculations, projections, and meetings. But no matter how hard he tried, the weight of the situation continued to press on him. His company was hanging by a thread, and every decision seemed to carry more consequences than the last. The creditors were getting impatient, and the media was still relentless. Jack could hear the rumors swirling, the whispers of his company's inevitable collapse. In moments of quiet, he would catch himself staring at his reflection, wondering if he was truly the man who had built this empire, or just someone who had been lucky enough to ride the wave for a while. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever, but Jack knew he couldn't afford to slow down. With every move he made, his company's future was on the line. But the one thing he hadn't counted on was the mounting pressure from within. Jack had always looked up to Adrian Blackwell, but something had changed in their last conversation. Adrian's once keen insights were now clouded with uncertainty. As they met again, Jack could see the toll the fall from grace had taken on him. The man who had once been a financial genius now seemed like a shell of his former self. "It's not just the money, Jack," Adrian said, his voice weary. "It's the trust. When that's gone, nothing can be rebuilt." Jack listened closely, but his mind was elsewhere. Trust had always been his greatest asset, and now it was slipping away from him. The investors were losing faith, the media was closing in, and his partner, Michael Roberts, had his own agenda. The only thing Jack knew for certain was that if he didn't regain control soon, there would be nothing left to salvage. Adrian's words were a reminder of what he had to lose, but Jack wasn't sure he could stop the collapse. Jack Spencer sat across from Michael Roberts, his longtime business partner. The tension in the air was thick. Michael had always been the calm and collected one, but today, his face was tight with worry. Jack's mind was consumed with thoughts of betrayal. Michael had his own ambitions and Jack knew it. But to confront him now would risk losing everything. Jack cleared his throat, trying to mask his growing unease. "We need to come up with a plan. A real plan," he said, his voice steady but firm. Michael nodded, but Jack could see the hesitation in his eyes. Jack's thoughts were racing, trying to figure out the next move. Could he trust Michael? The thought gnawed at him, but there was no time for doubt. He had to act, and fast. The walls were closing in, and Jack knew that whatever decision he made next would define the future of his company. As Jack left the meeting with Michael Roberts, his mind was spinning. The conversation had only made things more complicated. Jack's next steps were unclear. The creditors were breathing down his neck, and Michael's intentions were starting to feel more and more suspect. But as Jack walked down the corridor of his office building, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered, half expecting more bad news. "Jack," the voice on the other end said, "it's time to make a decision. You need to act now." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was familiar but distant, and the urgency in the words was undeniable. He didn't know who was on the other end, but he understood one thing. The game had changed. He had no choice but to make a bold move. But the question remained, was he ready to pay the price? Jack sat alone in his office, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The phone call had left him shaken, but he couldn't afford to waste time. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The world outside his office window was bustling, oblivious to the crisis unfolding within the walls of his company. Jack stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The rain had started to fall, the streets slick with water. In the distance, the flashing lights of a news van caught his eye. The media had arrived, and with it, the pressure. He could feel it closing in on him from all sides. His empire was crumbling, and Jack knew that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But he refused to go down without a fight. He would do whatever it took to save what was his, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The hidden fortune was the last thing Jack Spencer expected to find. His accountant had been working late, sorting through old records when a document surfaced, one Jack had never seen before. It was an old contract, buried deep within the archives. It detailed an investment from a long-forgotten backer, a hidden share of the company that Jack had no idea existed. The implications were massive. Money could stabilize the company, potentially giving him the breathing room he so desperately needed. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this discovery than mere luck. The sudden appearance of this fortune felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. Could this be the break he had been waiting for, or was it another trap? His mind raced as he considered the next steps. If he was going to use this money, he would have to move quickly. But there was a nagging doubt. Was someone else after it too? As Jack sat in his office, pondering the hidden fortune, his phone rang. It was Michael Roberts. Jack hesitated before answering, knowing that this conversation would change everything. "We need to talk," Michael said, his tone serious. Jack's stomach sank. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew Michael had been keeping things from him. Michael had always been a steady presence, but Jack had started to question whether he was still on his side. They met in a quiet corner of the office building, away from prying eyes. Michael's expression was grave. "I know about the fortune, Jack," he said, his voice low. Jack's heart raced. "You should have told me about it," Michael continued. "You don't know who you're dealing with. There are people who would kill for that kind of money." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Was Michael warning him, or was he trying to control the situation for himself? The conversation with Michael left Jack uneasy, but it was nothing compared to the moment he walked into the boardroom. As he entered, the silence was deafening. The investors sat in a tight circle, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of doubt and expectation. Jack felt a wave of nausea as he realized that they had all heard about the fortune, and they weren't pleased. The air was thick with tension as Jack stood at the head of the table. He knew that the investors had always been a tough crowd, but this was different. The stakes had never been higher. "We're using the money," Jack said, his voice steady, but the uncertainty was palpable. "We're going to turn this around." But the investors weren't convinced. They pushed back, questioning Jack's plan, and with each word, they chipped away at his confidence. This wasn't just about the money. It was about trust, and Jack knew that he had to win them over or risk losing everything. With the investors' skepticism weighing heavily on his mind, Jack Spencer retreated to his office. But he couldn't escape the feeling that something was off. The money was a temporary solution, but it wasn't the answer to his problems. As the rain began to pour outside, Jack found himself thinking about Sarah Edwards, the whistleblower. Her actions had sent shockwaves through the company, but she had also exposed the cracks in the system. Jack realized that he couldn't keep fighting the same battle in the same way. The traditional methods weren't working anymore. Something had to change. But what? His thoughts were interrupted by the doorbell. It was a courier, delivering an envelope with no return address. Inside, he found a series of cryptic messages, warnings about what was to come. Jack's heart raced as he read each one, realizing that the forces he was up against were far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Jack's pulse quickened as he read the final message. The warning was clear. There were forces at play that he couldn't control, and they were closing in on him. The rain outside had turned into a storm, and as the wind howled through the streets, Jack couldn't help but feel that his world was unraveling faster than he could repair it. The phone rang again, interrupting his thoughts. It was Adrian Blackwell. "You've been warned, Jack," Adrian said, his voice heavy with concern. "You need to be careful. People in your position don't get second chances." Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't need to be told twice. The danger was real, and Jack knew that if he didn't act quickly, it would be too late. He slammed the phone down and stared at the storm outside. The time for decisions had come. Jack Spencer sat in the center of the boardroom, his palms sweating as he prepared for the biggest gamble of his career. The fortune he had discovered had given him a temporary reprieve, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to turn things around in the long run. The creditors were still demanding repayment, and the investors' patience was wearing thin. Jack had no choice but to bet everything on a risky move. The market was volatile, and every trade could either save or destroy his future. He had placed his faith in high-risk assets before, but this time it was different. If this gamble didn't pay off, he would lose everything: his company, his reputation, and his last chance at redemption. Jack's mind raced as he dialed in the numbers for the trade, but a voice in the back of his mind told him that this decision could mark the end of his journey. The meeting with the sidekick was a turning point. Carla, Jack's trusted ally, had always been a steady voice in the chaos. Today, however, her expression was filled with doubt. "Are you sure this is the right move?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Jack could feel her concern, but he also knew that if they didn't act, the company would fall apart. The pressure was mounting, and Carla's pragmatism was starting to waver. Jack explained his plan in as much detail as he could, but the uncertainty in Carla's eyes didn't fade. "I've never seen you like this, Jack," she said, shaking her head. "This isn't just about money anymore. What are you really risking?" Jack took a deep breath. The truth was, he wasn't just risking his fortune. He was risking his soul, but he had come too far to turn back now. The phone call with the investor was worse than Jack had anticipated. "This deal isn't enough, Jack," the investor said, his tone cold. "We need more. You're gambling with everything we've put into this. If you don't deliver, we'll pull out." Jack's stomach tightened. The threat was clear. The investor wasn't bluffing. If Jack couldn't convince him to stay, everything he had fought for would vanish in an instant. "I can deliver," Jack replied, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. The pressure was unbearable. He had nothing left to offer except his ability to push the company to the brink. This was his last shot. The investor's response was a simple, "Prove it." The line went dead, and Jack was left staring at the phone in disbelief. He had to win or lose it all. The next few days were a blur of calculations, meetings, and late nights. Jack worked tirelessly, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. His relationship with Michael had become more strained, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was hiding something from him. But Jack didn't have the luxury of questioning every move. He had to act. As Jack sat at his desk, reviewing the numbers one last time, the door to his office opened. It was Michael. His face was unreadable, his hands empty. "I'm not here to argue, Jack," Michael said. "I'm here to help, but I need to know you're ready for what's coming." Jack's heart raced. Was Michael finally on his side? Or was this another move in a game Jack didn't fully understand? He had no choice but to trust him, for now. The stakes were too high to hesitate. Jack walked into the boardroom, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. The investors were waiting. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him, waiting to see if he would succeed or fail. This was his final chance. He had gambled everything: his fortune, his reputation, and his future, on a single high-stakes investment. Jack stood at the head of the table, looking each investor in the eye. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "I'm putting everything on the line. If we win, we recover everything. If we lose it all." The investors exchanged glances, the tension in the room palpable. Jack had made his choice, but the question remained. Would it be enough to save him? Or would he be left with nothing? Jack Spencer had reached his breaking point. The gamble had been made, and now all he could do was wait. Days turned into weeks as the results of his high-stakes investment started to unfold. The weight of uncertainty gnawed at him, and the constant pressure from the investors and creditors only made it worse. His office, once a symbol of power and success, now felt like a prison. He had poured every ounce of his energy into turning things around, but the results were still too close to call. Every phone call, every email, every decision felt like a countdown to either victory or disaster. The worst part was the loneliness. His colleagues, once close allies, were now distant figures, consumed by their own agendas. Jack felt isolated as if he were fighting this battle alone. Yet, in the silence of his office, he realized that the biggest battle wasn't against the market or the investors. It was against himself. The phone call was a turning point. Jack had expected the worst, but what he heard was even more shocking than he imagined. The investor on the other end of the line was calm, too calm. "We've decided to pull out, Jack," the voice said. "Your gamble didn't pay off." Jack's heart sank. He had been so sure that the investment would work, but now everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. "You're making a huge mistake," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the investor wasn't listening. The line went dead, and Jack was left staring at the phone, the weight of failure crashing down on him. The money, the empire, the trust, everything was gone. He had been so close, but in the end it wasn't enough. Jack slumped back in his chair, the feeling of defeat sinking in as the harsh reality set in. In the midst of his crushing defeat, Jack Spencer received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Edwards, the whistleblower. Jack had spent so much time thinking about how to fix the company, he hadn't even considered what he would say to her. She walked into his office, her expression unreadable. "You're in trouble, Jack," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something else, something Jack couldn't quite place. He had never trusted her completely, but now, in the face of everything he had lost, he realized that her role in all of this had been far more complicated than he originally thought. "I never wanted this for you," Sarah continued. "But you can still make it right." Jack's mind raced. Was this her attempt to offer a lifeline, or was it another twist in the game? One thing was certain. He had no more time to waste. If he wanted to rebuild, it had to start with facing the truth. Jack Spencer had made a decision. The time for hesitation was over. He would confront Michael Roberts once and for all. The truth had to come out, and Jack couldn't let the lies fester any longer. He stormed into Michael's office, his jaw clenched, his steps purposeful. "We need to talk," Jack said, his voice low but firm. Michael looked up from his desk, a mixture of surprise and guilt in his eyes. "I didn't want to do this, Jack," Michael said, his voice shaky. "But the pressure, you don't understand the forces we're up against." Jack's blood ran cold. Michael's words confirmed what Jack had feared all along. He had been played. Every move, every decision, had been part of a larger game, and Jack was nothing more than a pawn. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "I trusted you," Jack spat, "and now you've ruined everything." Jack stood at the edge of the precipice, looking out over the city that had once symbolized his triumph. Now, it felt like a reminder of all he had lost. The confrontation with Michael had shattered the last bit of trust Jack had held on to, and he knew that there was no going back. The media was circling, the creditors were closing in, and the investors had turned their backs. Jack was alone. As he looked out at the city, he realized that this was the end. He had fought so hard, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. The gamble had failed. The empire had crumbled, and now he was left with nothing. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil within him. Jack closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decisions, his failures, and the unbearable silence that followed. There was nothing left to do but accept the consequences. The storm had passed, but the damage remained. Jack Spencer sat in his office, the city outside now calm, but the weight of his decisions still pressing down on him. Everything he had worked for was gone. The creditors were still there, demanding payment, and the investors had already moved on to new ventures. But there was something different in the air today. A realization had settled within Jack. The battle was over, but the war was not lost. He had learned the hard way that the financial world was brutal, and only the strongest survived. Jack knew now that it wasn't just about money. It was about resilience. His fall had been swift, but perhaps his rise could be just as rapid. As he sat at his desk, the reflection of his own face staring back at him from the glass, Jack made a silent promise to himself. He would rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, but he had learned valuable lessons. He had nothing left to lose but everything to gain. It wasn't just the company that Jack had to rebuild. It was his own sense of self. He had been consumed by ambition, by the constant drive to stay on top. Now he understood the cost. His relationships had been strained and his integrity had been tested. But as he reflected on everything that had happened, he realized he had a chance to start over, to do things differently. It wouldn't be easy. The scars of his past mistakes would remain, but Jack was determined to learn from them. The financial world was still there, and Jack knew he had the skills to navigate it. But this time, he would do it with a sense of humility, not arrogance. The battle for survival was far from over, but Jack now understood what really mattered: trust, loyalty, and integrity. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could shape his future. And that was enough. Sarah Edwards had disappeared from Jack's life, but her impact remained. She had exposed the flaws in the system, and in doing so, she had forced Jack to confront his own. The financial system, the world he had worked so hard to build, was corrupt, and he had been part of it. But now, Jack understood the importance of transparency. He had a chance to fix things, to make a difference, and he was determined to take it. He couldn't undo the damage, but he could try to correct the course. As Jack moved forward, he realized that the system needed people like Sarah, people who weren't afraid to stand up for what was right. Maybe, just maybe, he could become one of them. It wasn't a promise to the world. It was a promise to himself. The phone rang again, and Jack Spencer hesitated before answering. It was Michael Roberts. Jack had no idea what to expect, but he knew that this conversation would be pivotal. When he answered, Michael's voice was more subdued than Jack remembered. "I'm sorry, Jack," Michael said. "I was caught up in the game, just like you. I never meant for things to go this far." Jack felt a mix of emotions: anger, relief, and a strange sense of closure. "It's too late for apologies, Michael," Jack replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "But I'll figure things out with or without you." Michael's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Jack wasn't sure if their relationship could ever be repaired, but he didn't need it to be. Jack had learned that he was the one who had to rebuild his future. He couldn't rely on anyone else to fix it for him. The final decision was Jack's to make. He stood in front of the window, looking out at the skyline. The city was still standing, just as he was. He had lost everything and gained more than he had ever expected. The storm had passed, and Jack knew the rebuilding process would take time. But he was no longer afraid. The lessons he had learned, though painful, were worth the price. Jack had always believed in control, of the market, of people, and of his destiny. But now, he understood that true power lay in adaptability, resilience, and the willingness to start over. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack made a vow to himself. He would rise again, not as the man he once was, but as someone who understood what truly mattered. The future was uncertain, but Jack was ready to face it, no matter the cost.